Good evening, everybody. Good evening to everybody watching at home, too, maybe just now tuning in. We're going to be back in the book of 2 Samuel, continuing our study on the book of Samuel. What we have in our Bibles is 1 and 2 Samuel. Introduction of Samuel early on in the book of Samuel gives way to the rise and fall of Israel's first king. Who was Israel's first king? Saul. Very good. And while Saul was falling, David was on the rise. And so 1 Samuel concludes and 2 Samuel begins with Saul and his son Jonathan, David's best friend, having been killed, and David mourning heavily. And then he is established as king, and we find out David's a very good king. Both politically and religiously, does some very, very good stuff there at the beginning of 2 Samuel, until a grave personal sin. And that's what we saw last week in chapter 11, and the consequences even after that. And as a result of that grave personal sin, it almost seems like the wheels have fallen off of at least his family life. For sure. One of the issues was Amnon, one of David's sons, raping his half-sister Tamar, and then her full brother Absalom getting so mad that he kills Amnon. Anytime you think your family is bad, just go to 2 Samuel chapters 13 or 11 through 14, and you'll see it's like, okay, maybe it's not that bad. Half-brother rapes his half-sister, is killed by his half-brother. David struggles with forgiveness with Absalom, but then he half-heartedly welcomes him home, but then, as you saw last week, kind of ignores him, just kind of leaves him alone. And he says, hey, you're welcome back in Jerusalem, but I don't want to see you. And that's where we pick up the story tonight in chapter 15. Once again, as we've seen throughout this study, this genre specifically of Israel's history is a lot to get through at a time. So we're going to be reading a lot tonight. I'm going to be skipping quite a bit. We're going to try to make it all the way through chapter 20. So lots of reading, and I'm going to warn you ahead of time, even before we get to the so what. Application in this particular story isn't exactly forthcoming. So I challenge you to maybe, as we listen and as we talk through this story, to find some application to our lives today, what we can learn from this, and how it points to our need for Christ, if nothing else. And so we've left Absalom as half-heartedly forgiven by David and then completely ignored. And so that's where we pick up the story of chapter 15, verse 1. After this, Absalom bought a chariot and horses, which I understand is the equivalent of a Corvette or a Porsche or something. This is very much for appearance's sake. And he hired 50 bodyguards to run ahead of him. He got up early every morning and went out to the gate of the city. When people brought a case to the king for judgment, Absalom would ask where in Israel they were from, and they would tell him their tribe. Then Absalom would say, you've got a really strong case here. It's too bad the king doesn't have anyone to hear it. I wish I were the judge. Then everyone could bring their cases to me for judgment, and I would give them justice. Well, just quick pause. What's Absalom doing here? I think we have a word for it today. It's called politics. He's kind of snaking his way in, making some promises, kind of making them question the king. What'd you say, Judy? Putting some spin on things. Yep, not even letting them get to the king and saying, well, the king doesn't have time for you. Verse 5, when people tried to bow before him, so you already see there's some loyalty there, Absalom wouldn't let them. Instead, he took them by the hand and kissed them. Absalom did this with everyone who came to the king for judgment, and so he stole the hearts of all the people of Israel. After 4 years, apparently, of this activity, Absalom said to the king, let me go to Hebron to offer a sacrifice to the Lord and fulfill a vow I made to him. For while your servant was at Geshur in Aram, I promised to sacrifice to the Lord in Hebron if he would bring me back to Jerusalem. All right, the king told him, go and fulfill your vow. So Absalom went to Hebron. But while he was there, he sent secret messengers to all the tribes of Israel to stir up a rebellion against the king. As soon as you hear the ram's horn, his message read, you are to say, Absalom has been crowned king in Hebron. He took 200 men from Jerusalem with him as guests, but they knew nothing of his intentions. While Absalom was offering the sacrifices, he sent for Ahithophel, one of David's counselors who lived in Gilo. Soon, many others joined Absalom, and the conspiracy gained momentum. So I think Absalom got what he was after, right? He said, okay, if my father's going to ignore me, I'm going to take him out. Presumably, Absalom was the next in line for the crown. So he just kind of wanted to go ahead and fast forward that. Instead of his father before him, who waited patiently while a man, ruled evilly, instead, Absalom said, I want it now. And so he began his politics for about 4 years, ran a campaign against his father and for him, and then finally makes a couple of political moves. And now, I feel like it's kind of left out of Samuel here. Absalom is seen as king. And that's what's so weird that's left off of the pages here. It's like, oh my gosh, he won. He did this. He pulled this off. Because as we pick it up in verse 13 here, David is finding out he needs to flee for his life. Verse 13, a messenger soon arrived in Jerusalem to tell David, all Israel has joined Absalom in a conspiracy against you. Then we must flee at once, or it will be too late, David urged his men. Hurry, if we get out of the city before Absalom arrives, both we and the city of Jerusalem will be spared from disaster. So really, David had the people as much on his mind as he did his own safety. We are with you, his advisors replied. Do what you think is best. So the king and all his household set out at once. He left no one behind except 10 of his concubines to look after the palace. The king and all his people set out on foot, pausing at the last house to let all the king's men move past to lead the way. There were 600 men from Gath who had come with David, along with the king's bodyguard. Then the king turned and said to Ittai, a leader of the men from Gath, why are you coming with us? Go on back to King Absalom, for you are a guest in Israel, a foreigner in exile. You arrived only recently, and should I force you today to wander with us? I don't even know where we will go. Go on back and take your kinsmen with you, and may the Lord show you his unfailing love and faithfulness. But Ittai said to the king, I vow by the Lord and by your own life that I will go wherever my lord the king goes, no matter what happens, whether it means life or death. David replied, all right, come with us. So Ittai and all his men and their families went along. Everyone cried loudly as the king and his followers passed by. They crossed the Kidron Valley and then went out toward the wilderness. Zadok and all the Levites also came along, carrying the ark of the covenant of God. They set down the ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until everyone had passed out of the city. Then the king instructed Zadok to take the ark of God back into the city. If the Lord sees fit, David said, he will bring me back to see the ark and the tabernacle again. But if he is through with me, then let him do what he seems best to him. The king also told Zadok the priest, look, here is my plan. You and Abiathar should return quietly to the city with your sons Ahimaaz and Abiathar's son Jonathan. I will stop at the shallows of the Jordan River and wait there for a report from you. So Zadok and Abiathar took the ark of God back to the city and stayed there. David walked up the road to the Mount of Olives, something that should be familiar to us, weeping as he went. His head was covered and his feet were bare as a sign of mourning. And the people who were with him covered their heads and wept as they climbed the hill. When someone told David that his advisor Ahithophel was now backing Absalom, David prayed, O Lord, let Ahithophel give Absalom foolish advice. When David reached the summit of the Mount of Olives where people worshiped God, Hushai the Archite was waiting there for him. Hushai had torn his clothing and put dirt on his head as a sign of mourning. But David told him, if you go with me, you will only be a burden. Return to Jerusalem and tell Absalom, I will now be your advisor, O king, just as I was your father's advisor in the past. Then you can frustrate and counter Ahithophel's advice. Zadok and Abiathar the priests will be there. Tell them about these plans and being made in the king's palace, and they will send their sons, Ahimaaz and Jonathan, to tell me what is going on." So David's friend Hushai returned to Jerusalem, getting there just as Absalom arrived. Whew, that was a lot to read, but it really sets the scene. I'm going to be skipping some parts here, but I wanted you to be introduced to all of these characters that you've got going on. So let's quickly review. Absalom has gone to Hebron, where David's advisor, Ahithophel, who's going to be a key figure in this, has now joined him and this revolt. And so David has now fled Jerusalem. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. They took the ark as far as out of Jerusalem, but then David urged them to leave the ark in Jerusalem. And so David's friend Hushai will also return to Jerusalem and kind of be almost undercover here as an advisor. The priest's sons will inform David of what is going on. And so that's kind of setting the scene here. I wish I could do a better job, but we need a movie of this, don't we? I mean, that would be nice. It would be, most of the Old Testament would be a very interesting film for sure. So then we go on to chapter 16 here, and we have a couple of different figures that David meets as he's leaving Jerusalem. One of them will be familiar to you. Verse 1. When David had gone a little beyond the summit of the Mount of Olives, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, was waiting there for him. He had 2 donkeys loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, 100 bunches of summer fruit, and a wineskin full of wine. "What are these for?" the king asked Ziba. Ziba replied, "The donkeys are for the king's people to ride on, and the bread and summer fruit are for the young men to eat. The wine is for those who become exhausted in the wilderness." "And where is Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson?" the king asked. Does everybody remember who that was? He was the grandson of Saul that was handicapped. And so David showed him great favor. And so David's asking about him. Ziba replies, "He stayed in Jerusalem. He said, 'Today I will get back the kingdom of my grandfather Saul.'" "In that case," the king told Ziba, "I give you everything Mephibosheth owns. I bow before you," Ziba replied. "May I always be pleasing to you, my lord, the king." So as if David hadn't felt betrayed enough, now he finds out Mephibosheth has stayed behind because now he sees an opening. So we'll come back to that story a little bit later. One of the others that David meets on his way out is a man called Shimei. This man from Saul's family came out to curse David. Basically just came out and just started jeering at him and mocking him and basically saying, "You stole the throne from Saul, so now see what's happening to you? The throne's being stolen from you." And so David's men were ready to take care of him and say, "You want us to go ahead and kill him?" David said, "No, leave him alone." Maybe God put those words in his mouth. Maybe God is inspiring him to say this. And so just leave him be. It's not that big a deal. And so David and his men stopped at the Jordan to rest, right where he said he was going to, at the shallows. And we fast forward to verse 15 of chapter 16. "Meanwhile, Absalom and all the army of Israel arrived at Jerusalem, accompanied by Ahithophel. When David's friend Hushai the Archite arrived, he went immediately to see Absalom. 'Long live the king!' he exclaimed. 'Long live the king!' 'Is this the way you treat your friend David?' Absalom asked him. 'Why aren't you with him?' 'Well, I'm here because I belong to the man who is chosen by the Lord and by all the men of Israel,' Hushai replied. 'And anyway, why shouldn't I serve you? Just as I was your father's advisor, now I will be your advisor.'" So it's good to have a man on the inside, right? Then Absalom turned to Ahithophel and asked him, "So, what shall I do next?" And so he's got 2 advisors now. He's got Ahithophel and he's got Hushai. They're going to basically give him advice. They were just the king's advisors. Ahithophel at this point advised Absalom, "Well, your first step is to go sleep with your father's concubines who he left behind." And so Absalom said, "I think that's a good idea." And he went and he did that. to basically show, see, my father is gone, it's over. And so that was a political statement. It was an incredibly immoral one. I mean, the whole thing's messed up to begin with, I know, but he's trying to make the statement that this is my palace now. And then Ahithophel advised him to go immediately after David while he was still tired. Look, your dad's tired. All of his men are tired. You should go after him while they're still feeling this fatigue. But then Hushai stepped in and he reminded him, hey guys, you're forgetting. David and all his men are incredible warriors. You think they're tired? You don't think they've been tired before? You know, they've been tired, and they're not going to run away from David. This is not going to be an easy fight. David was a mighty warrior, and his men aren't just going to run away. And so after hearing both these pieces of advice, verse 14 of chapter 17, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, Hushai's advice is better than Ahithophel's, for the Lord had determined to defeat the counsel of Ahithophel, which really was the better plan, so that he could bring disaster on Absalom. I love that little note that we get from the editor of Samuel here as he's putting these stories together. Ahithophel's plan was better. It was true. David was exhausted. He felt betrayed. It would have been the perfect time to attack. But luckily, Hushai was able to divert their plan and say, hey, no, guys, I don't think you should do this. And so they took Hushai's advice, which now gives him time to warn David. Verse 15, Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar the priests what Ahithophel had said to Absalom and the elders of Israel, and what he himself had advised instead. Quick, he told them, find David and urge him not to stay at the shallows of the Jordan River tonight. He must go across at once into the wilderness beyond. Otherwise, he will die and his entire army with him. And so as they had planned, Zadok and Abiathar's sons were outside the city of Jerusalem. They sent word by a servant girl, but they were seen, and so they hid in a well, and they did finally escape to David, and they did warn him. Meanwhile, Ahithophel was so upset that his advice was not taken. It says he got his affairs in order, went back to his hometown, and he killed himself. And so he took that pretty hard, I guess, which I'm very glad, because now I don't have to say his name anymore because I'm about to sprain my tongue. So we pick up the story back in chapter 17 at verse 24 with this. David soon arrived at Mahanaim, and by now Absalom had mobilized the entire army of Israel and was leading his troops across the Jordan River. Absalom had appointed Amasa as commander of his army, replacing Joab, who had been commander under David. Amasa was Joab's cousin. His father was Jether, an Ishmaelite. His mother, Abigail, daughter of Nahash, was the sister of Joab's mother, Zeruiah. Absalom and the Israelite army set up camp in the land of Gilead. So notice right there, Joab has been replaced by Absalom, by his cousin, a name you'll want to remember in the story, Amasa. And so Joab now, you're going to find out, is free to go back and serve David, which you'll see him do in the next scene. And so David was welcomed by many people in that area, and he was given all kinds of supplies by his army, for his army. And so verse 1 of chapter 18 then, David now mustered the men who were with him and appointed generals and captains to lead them. He sent the troops out in 3 groups, placing one group under Joab. So now Joab is serving David. One under Joab's brother, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and one under Ittai. You remember him, the man from Gath. The king told his troops, I am going out with you. So what's going on here is David is mobilizing. He knows Absalom is coming with all of Israel's army. And so he takes his men. By the way, isn't this sad? I mean, this is so sad to see that this is a civil war, is what this is. Don't miss that fact. So Absalom is coming with all his army, and David has these 3 sharp generals, and he puts them in his command, and he's kind of learned his lesson from Bathsheba, because as you saw last time in chapter 11, David should have been at war. He should have been away. Well, he says, I'm going with you. I am the king. You are fighting for me. I'm going to lead you into this battle. But verse 3, his men objected strongly. You must not go, they urged. If we have to turn and run, even if half of us die, it will make no difference to Absalom's troops. They will be looking only for you. You are worth 10,000 of us, and it is better that you stay here in the town and send help if we need it. If you think that's the best plan, I'll do it, the king answered. So he stood alongside the gate of the town as all the troops marched out in groups of hundreds and of thousands. And the king gave his command to Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. For my sake, deal gently with young Absalom. And all the troops heard the king give this order to his commanders. We call that foreshadowing. So David's telling them, hey, I know Absalom is the one after me, but he's still my son. Be gentle with him. Basically, he's saying, take him alive. Verse 6, so we've prepared for this battle. David's got his men. Absalom's coming with all of the army of Israel. And so the battle began in the forest of Ephraim, and the Israelite troops were beaten back by David's men. There was a great slaughter that day, and 20,000 men laid down their lives. Again, very sad when you see this in context. The battle raged all across the countryside, and more men died because of the forest than were killed by the sword. Interestingly enough, I looked that up, and nobody really knows what that means. Were there poisonous snakes? Were there animals throughout these forests? Some people think that maybe David's men had set traps all through the forest. And so it wasn't a direct attack, but it was the fact that they were trying to make their way through the forest that killed all of these Israelites. During the battle, Absalom happened to come upon some of David's men. He tried to escape on his mule, but as he rode beneath the thick branches of a great tree, his hair got caught in the tree. His mule kept going, and it left him dangling in the air. Pause. What was it you guys remember from last week and the description of Absalom? What one feature was pointed out more than anything? His hair. He only cut it once a year. If you remember, he was a beautiful man. Genetics, David was good looking, so Absalom it was probably a very nice. It's just so, don't miss the irony here, that the very thing that probably gave him a lot of power is now causing him to dangle from a tree. I think it's funny. Verse 10, one of David's men saw what happened and told Joab, I saw Absalom dangling from a great tree. What? Joab demanded. You saw him there and you didn't kill him? I would have rewarded you with 10 pieces of silver and a hero's belt. I would not kill the king's son for even 1,000 pieces of silver, the man replied to Joab. We all heard the king say to you and Abishai and Ittai, for my sake, please spare young Absalom. And if I had betrayed the king by killing his son, and the king would certainly find out who did it, you yourself would be the first to abandon me. Enough of this nonsense, Joab said. Then he took 3 daggers and he plunged them into Absalom's heart as he dangled, still alive, in the great tree. 10 of Joab's young armor-bearers then surrounded Absalom and killed him. Then Joab blew the ram's horn, and his men returned from chasing the army of Israel. They threw Absalom's body into a deep pit in the forest and piled a great heap of stones over it. All of Israel fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had built a monument to himself in the king's valley, for he said, I have no son to carry on my name. He named the monument after himself and is known as Absalom's Monument to this day. So, Absalom would be a fun character study, wouldn't it? You see him getting revenge for his sister's rape by taking his half-brother's life, and then he tries to... Apparently, he's an incredibly charming young man, knew how to work it politically, was able to turn Israel completely against their king, which is utterly amazing when you think about it. So he had political skills. He was apparently a good-looking man, but this now is his life. It is over. He's hung in a tree by his beauty, by his hair. And so then what follows is a little bit of an argument over who gets to tell David the news about Absalom. Believe it or not, they're arguing to do it. I don't know why. They must not have learned what David does to bad messengers. And so let's fast forward to verse 33 when David actually finds out the news. The king was overcome with emotion. He went up to the room over the gateway and burst into tears. And as he went, he cried, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." And so David's heart is absolutely broken. Yes, his son was trying to assassinate him, but it was still his son. Some of you, if you've had a prodigal child, you know they never stop being your child. Even when they're trying to kill you, even when they've turned the entire nation against you and are coming with all of the army of that nation, he's still the son. And so David is in incredible mourning once again for somebody who was trying to kill him. Interesting story arc that David has for sure. Chapter 19, word soon reached Joab that the king was weeping and mourning for Absalom. As all the people heard of the king's deep grief for his son, the joy of that day's victory was turned into deep sadness. They crept back into the town that day as though they were ashamed and had deserted in a battle. The king covered his face with his hands and kept on crying, "Oh, my son Absalom! Oh, Absalom, my son, my son!" Then Joab went to the king's room and said to him, I love this. Joab is the one guy who can really talk to David without pulling any punches, isn't he? Went to the king's room and said to him, "We saved your life today and the lives of your sons, your daughters, your wives, your concubines, yet you act like this, making us feel ashamed of ourselves. You seem to love those who hate you and hate those who love you. You have made it clear today that your commanders and troops mean nothing to you. It seems that if Absalom had lived and all of us had died, you'd be pleased. Now go out there and congratulate your troops. For I swear by the Lord that if you don't go out, not a single one of them will remain here tonight. Then you will be worse off than ever before." I love that. Everybody needs a good friend that just tells you how it is, huh? Verse 8, so the king went out and he took his seat at the town gate. And as the news spread throughout the town that he was there, everyone went to him. So he once again began acting like king. Meanwhile, the second part of verse 8, the Israelites who had supported Absalom fled to their homes. And throughout all the tribes of Israel, there was much discussion and argument going on. The people were saying, "The king rescued us from our enemies and saved us from the Philistines, but Absalom chased him out of the country. Now Absalom, who we appointed to rule over us, is dead. Why don't we ask David to come back and be our king again?" Then King David sent Zadok and Abiathar the priests to say to the elders of Judah, "Why are you the last ones to welcome back the king into his palace? For I've heard that all of Israel is ready." And so what's going on there, the rest of the tribes of Israel kind of repented and said, "Hey, we messed up. Why don't we ask David to be our king again?" But Judah did not. And so that's what he's saying. Why aren't you guys asking me? Verse 12, "You are my relatives and my own tribe, my own flesh and blood. So why are you the last ones to welcome back the king?" David told them to tell Amasa. Do you remember Amasa? He was the one that replaced Joab, Joab's cousin, one that replaced Joab as Absalom's commander. And so this is what David tells him. "Since you are my own flesh and blood, like Joab," so he's from the tribe of Judah, "may God strike me and even kill me if I do not appoint you as commander of my army in his place." Did you catch what happened there? David just took the general that was leading the entire Israelite army to kill him and said, "Hey, Joab, you directly disobeyed my order and killed my son. Amasa is now in control of my army as well." Either an incredibly political move, or what did you say, Mike? You're fired. Yes, you're fired. And Amasa is now in charge. And so as a result of this unites the tribes once again, because Amasa is from Judah. And so verse 14, "Then Amasa convinced all the men of Judah, and they responded unanimously. They sent word to the king, 'Return to us and bring back all who are with you.' And so everything's been reunited. You could say this was a political move by David, and it probably was, but it was also an act of extreme forgiveness, I would argue, as he puts this general in control once again. And so now in verse 15, David is returning to Jerusalem. And so we're going to see the payoff of a couple of different stories here, some of which I skipped, I'm sorry, but I told you at least the gist of it. First, let's just read verse 15. As he's returning to Jerusalem. So the king started back to Jerusalem, and when he arrived at the Jordan River, the people of Judah came to Gilgal to meet him and escort him across the river. David remained popular, didn't he? I mean, he still had a following throughout this, and now they're welcoming him back into the capital city. Shimei, son of Gera, the man from Bahurim and Benjamin, hurried across with the men of Judah to welcome King David. You remember him and what he said? I'll come back to that in a second. Verse 17, 1,000 other men from the tribe of Benjamin were with him, including Ziba, the chief servant of the house of Saul, and Ziba's 15 sons and 20 servants. They rushed down to the Jordan to meet the king. They crossed the shallows of the Jordan to bring the king's household across the river, helping him in every way they could. So you've got a couple of people here, interestingly enough. Shimei and Ziba both interacted with David on his way out of Jerusalem, if you remember. And so now we're seeing them again on his way back into Jerusalem. Do you remember? I skipped over it. We didn't read it, but do you remember what Shimei basically said to David? He said, hey, this is your fault. He's Saul's relative. He says he cursed him. He jeered him. He mocked him on his way out. And so now he's one of the first to greet him and say, hey, welcome home, David. Welcome home. Well, David's men pick up on this and basically say, hey, we didn't forget who you are. David, you want me to go ahead and take care of him? What do you think David does? He lets him go. Once again, shows mercy to this man who is just doing nothing but mocking him. Incredible act of mercy for sure. Then we need to deal with Ziba, and we got to finish out this story. The caretaker of all of Saul's property and the servant to Mephibosheth. If you remember, he told David that Mephibosheth had abandoned him. Now we get the rest of the story. Chapter 19, verse 24. Now Mephibosheth, Saul's grandson, came down from Jerusalem to meet the king. He had not cared for his feet, trimmed his beard, or washed his clothes since the day the king left Jerusalem. So in other words, he had been in mourning, and David clearly saw this. And so he asked, why didn't you come with me, Mephibosheth? The king asked him. Mephibosheth replied, my lord the king, my servant Ziba deceived me. I told him, saddle my donkey so I can go with the king, for as you know, I am crippled. Ziba has slandered me by saying that I refuse to come. But I know that my lord the king is like an angel of God. So do what you think is best. All my relatives and I could expect only death from you, my lord. But instead you have honored me by allowing me to eat at your own table. What more can I ask? You said enough, David replied. I've decided that you and Ziba will divide your land equally between you. Give him all of it, Mephibosheth said. I am content just to have you safely back again, my lord the king. It is interesting when somebody meets you outside of the city and appears to be helping you and badmouths somebody else. There's a chance that they're not telling you the truth, that they're just trying to curry favor and they're lying about somebody else. It's an interesting part of the story for sure. David also shown kindness to those who had provided for him during that time, those who had provided for his army. A couple of names are mentioned here. Then we have a little bit of argument because the people of Judah went out to welcome David, and the people of Israel didn't get to, even though Judah was the last to say, yes, you're our king again. And so we fast forward to chapter 20. Why not another revolt? How about one more? Sound fun? There happened to be a troublemaker there named Sheba, son of Bichri, a man from the tribe of Benjamin. Sheba blew a ram's horn and began to chant, "Down with the dynasty of David. We have no interest in the son of Jesse. Come on, you men of Israel, back to your homes." So all the men of Israel deserted David and followed Sheba, son of Bichri. But the men of Judah stayed with their king and escorted him from the Jordan River to Jerusalem. So, because Judah slipped in and said, okay, yes, he's our king too, and we're there to greet him first, now all of Israel's jealous, and Sheba is saying, well, hey, we don't need this Judean guy anymore. Let's go and do our own thing. And so, Israel, back to your homes, and Sheba begins to lead this revolt. And so, David sends Amasa after Sheba and his army. But Amasa, you remember him, Joab's cousin, who he put in charge now of his army. Amasa took too long to, ironically, amass an army. Get it? No? Okay, I thought it was funny. So David sends Joab after him and says, hey, he's taken too long to put an army together. Sheba's heading back. We got to get after him. And so Joab, in true Joab fashion, met Amasa, says with his right hand, hey, cousin, how you doing? And then with his left hand pulls out a dagger and stabs him and cuts him open. We're given some details about entrails spilling out onto the road and people being distracted by it, so they end up just throwing him off into a field. But anyway, Joab's in charge again. So they chased Sheba to the town of Abel, where now Joab is going to meet an old woman at the wall. I love this story. Verse 16. But a wise woman in the town called out to Joab, listen to me, Joab. Come over here so I can talk to you. As he approached, the woman asked, are you Joab? I am, he replied. So she said, listen carefully to your servant. I'm listening, he said. Then she continued, well, there used to be a saying, if you want to settle an argument, ask advice in the town of Abel. In other words, this is where you'll find wisdom. This is where you'll find wise advice. Verse 19, I am the one who is peace-loving and faithful in Israel, but you're destroying an important town in Israel. Why do you want to devour what belongs to the Lord? Joab had been attacking Abel, this city, its walls, and trying to bring it down. Verse 20, Joab replied, believe me, I don't want to devour or destroy your town. That's not my purpose. All I want is a man named Sheba, son of Bichri, from the hill country of Ephraim, who has revolted against King David. If you hand over this one man to me, I will leave the town in peace. All right, the woman replied, we'll throw his head over the wall to you. Then the woman went to all the people with her wise advice, and they cut off Sheba's head, and they threw it out to Joab. So he blew the ram's horn, and he called his troops back from the attack. They all returned to their homes, and Joab returned to the king at Jerusalem. So one wise old woman took him out. I love that. I don't know why. I just love that story. Just throwing the head over the wall. Here he is. The last few verses of chapter 20 kind of give us a summary of where we're at this point. And then where we'll pick up next week in the final chapters of 2 Samuel are a summary really of David's whole life. And so it's kind of more of a poetic type end to this. So this is really the end of the story of David's life in Samuel. Now Joab was the commander of the army of Israel. Benaniah, son of Jehoiada, was captain of the king's bodyguard. Adoniram was in charge of forced labor. Jehoshaphat, son of Ahilud, was the royal historian. Shiva was the court secretary. Zadok and Abiathar were the priests. And Ira, a descendant of Jair, was David's personal priest. Whew! Told you it was a lot of narrative, a lot to read. Very interesting story. Probably some, if you had read this before or heard some of these stories before and you're like me, I'd kind of forgotten some of these details. I remember Absalom's revolt in general, but the details I don't really remember. So it is a nice review. But like I said, we always like to close Wednesday night with a couple of so whats. Oh boy. Listen to wise women at the wall. I've got a couple here. What'd you say, Mike? Don't trust your cousin, especially when he says, hey, cuz. Watch his left hand. It might have a dagger in it, especially if his name's Joab. Here's a couple that I came up with, and then I'll let you add to it if you came up with some application as well. There's not a lot of good news here, no easy application. So this first one I think is relevant to us still. Even after forgiveness of sin, there are consequences to sin. A lot of scholars, a lot of commentators blame a lot of what happened on David. Why? Doesn't seem like it was his fault. What could David have done differently? He could have, in many ways, his ignoring of Absalom caused this rift in the family. But even if you back that up, a lot of this came from his sin, just ignoring his duties as a king, as a father, even. And so, do you believe David got forgiveness from God after Nathan confronted him? I do. I do. Even after, man, if you read Psalm 51, just a gorgeous psalm of David's repentance. And it's like, that's what repentance looks like. And yet, there's still consequences. God will maybe remove that eternal penalty, will remove what he holds against us, but there are still natural consequences to our sin. Pauline, you were going to say? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yep. You feel sorry for David a little bit. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Well, he did. He's still, I would still argue, he's one of the best kings that Israel ever had, just because you do see compassion and forgiveness when other kings would not have. Yeah. Yep. He was. It was indeed. The second one I came up with was I think you see in this a pattern that God's people will face rejection, won't they? I mean, it happens. You see people stirring up against David. David was God's anointed. We see that from the beginning. And yet Shammai, on the way out of Jerusalem, says, you stole the throne from Saul, and now you're getting what you deserved. Other people rejected David, people that at the time he thought Mephibosheth had. There's all kinds of betrayal, rejection. You will feel that as God's chosen person. As a Christian, as a follower of Christ, you will experience that. Sometimes deservingly so. Meaning sometimes it was the natural consequences of a bad decision that you made. Sometimes it had nothing to do with what you did. But here, what I think we see from David's life is always react with humility. Because even with Mephibosheth, he reacts with humility, doesn't hold it against anybody, and he finds out later the story wasn't true anyway. Even with Shimei, he treats him with respect and humility, and then comes back later and does it again. He shows mercy, he shows forgiveness. And I think there is a little bit of a life lesson for us in that. Hey, people are going to be against you sometimes. What is your reaction? Is it to come at them and go against them? No, it's to show them mercy, to show them forgiveness, to be humble in those circumstances. Now, sometimes I guess you have to defend yourselves, but in general, it still comes down to God is in control. That's what he said when his advisors wanted to kill Shimei on the way out of town. David says, you know what? Maybe God told him to say that. Who am I to say? And so there's such great humility in David's heart here still, even in the midst of all of this. And then finally, one last so what I think is an important one, that through all of this, you could be reading this, and if we didn't know the end, we thought, oh my gosh, God promised to establish a dynasty with David. When David wanted to build a house for God, God said, no, I'm going to build a house for you in chapter 7, remember? Now, wait, it's all falling apart. Absalom's not the way this is supposed to go. He's not a good king. This is not, but yet God in his sovereignty works through forests with trees that can grab people's hair and little old ladies at the wall and Abel. And I mean, just don't doubt that God keeps his promises. You do remember that part, huh? The wise old woman or the hair? I just can't get that out of my head. Him just kind of dangling there. Just somebody help, help. Any other application that you would add? Like I said, a very, very weird part of the story, but anything that you want to add tonight, or that you would say, hey, I really learned this about life tonight? Yeah, Richard. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep. Oh, did it really? I didn't catch that. Like chapter 13 or something? 14? I'll look that up for you, Richard, and see what the theories on that are. But my guess would be maybe those sons had perished. Maybe they were stepsons. Maybe they, for some reason, weren't in line for the throne because of who he married and had that son with. So let me look that up for you. Nice catch, though, man. Very nice catch, Mike. Probably. I think there. At the very least, he should have found some way to handle the situation. Whether it's punishing Absalom or forgiving him, bringing him in, chastising him, whatever. Instead, he just swept it under the carpet. And just kind of, he didn't deal with it, and so it came back to deal with him. Is that kind of what you're thinking? Probably would have been. Yep, by the law. But we've seen David show forgiveness, and we can't fault him for that. But I would fault him for not handling the situation either way. He just kind of ignored the situation, and it didn't go away. And yeah, God uses it. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah, yep. Yeah. It seems to be a trend here in Samuel especially, huh? So we see Eli do it, we saw Samuel do it, and now David did it. Yeah. And to Mike's point, I mean, if he would have followed the law and just went ahead and said, Absalom, you did something you shouldn't have done, none of this would have happened. Yep. But I think David was probably torn too at what Amnon had done to Tamar. You know, it's like, because that's his daughter. Yeah, right, exactly. That's true, and that's maybe that's where this all starts. Had he disciplined Amnon for what he did to Tamar, maybe Absalom doesn't feel like he has to take matters into his own hands, and then all of this happens. So yeah, all of it comes back to if David would have done what David should have done, this doesn't unfold, probably. But to Joe's point, he used all of David's mistakes for his purposes. Donna. Yep. Yeah. 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 And off the record, I'll give you some of my theories on that. But yes, my generation struggles with disciplining their children. They really do. Kids get in trouble at school. Who is it? Whose fault is it? The teacher's fault. That's the pattern we see today. Drives me crazy. Let's pray. God, even though this is a very dark story to the point where we just kind of laugh at some of the violence and chuckle at some of the darkness, I pray that we would be able to learn something, if nothing else, how dark the human heart is and our need for you. In the midst of all of his issues and problems, we see David still have a heart of compassion and forgiveness. And so, God, we pray that we would at least learn to emulate that, not because we're trying to be like David, but because we're trying to be like you. I pray that we would learn that you are in control and that your promises come through every single time. We will face rejection, but we should respond in humility. And God, even though you do forgive us from our sin, and in Christ there is forgiveness, that doesn't mean we don't live with the consequences of choices that we've made in life. And so, God, help us to learn all these lessons and more and point to Christ in all that we do. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Bless you guys. See you Sunday.